All right, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so very much for joining us today. I'm so excited to have you here with us. We have an amazing panel lined up to talk with you about guaranteed income, to get into some of the nitty-gritty details about what it is, some of the outcomes associated with guaranteed income, and how it's a tool for both stability and economic mobility. Our discussion is part of our webinar series, In Pursuit of Economic Justice, where we will bring together experts to help inform and educate our partners on some of the most promising interventions to help close the racial wealth gap in our region, but in communities across the entire country. In 2021, our community foundation made a bold decision to embark upon a 10-year strategic vision in pursuit of economic justice, and really laser focused on how we close, how we address, how we respond to the racial wealth gap in our region. We are looking at a number of strategies and interventions that move us from stability, which is where a lot of our work over many years has focused, to mobility, and then eventually to prosperity. One of the prime economic mobility, stabilization and mobility strategies focuses on guaranteed income. And during the pandemic, we had the benefit of both investing in a broad number of cash transfer programs, and we also provided support and facilitation to local government in moving millions of dollars in resources of cash transfer resources to people who were unable to afford rent or medicine or food or basic needs to support their families. And we know our economy is completely out of balance. The cost of living in our region has certainly outpaced wages. And so as we continue to recover from the devastating impact of the pandemic, we are looking at a number of interventions to help stabilize people in our community. We are very proud to be the current partner to the Guaranteed Basic Income pilot in Washington, D.C. Let's Go DMV. We're an investor in the Montgomery County pilot program, in Arlington's Guarantee, and we're helping to instigate with the County Council a new guaranteed income pilot in Prince George's County. And so we see ourselves deeply invested in this work, wanting to continue to learn more and to refine our strategies and approaches. And we've brought with us today a couple of experts to help us to glean some additional experiences based on their work and investments. And so I'm really happy to bring to the table Ms. Natalie Foster. Natalie is the president and founder of the Economic Security Project, a network to support the exploration and experiments of guaranteed income. Natalie will share the research and outcomes on guaranteed income programs nationally. And she has an incredibly amazing background that I hope in her introductory remarks she'll give us a deeper window into. I'm also happy to welcome to the webinar Geeta Pradhan, who is the CEO of the Cambridge Community Foundation. And in 2021, Cambridge piloted an 18-month guaranteed income pilot project for single caretaker households. And you'll get to hear more about Geeta's very extensive background and specifically her exposure and experience in this work more especially. And so I want to start by welcoming our two panelists again and invite them to, why don't you just kind of give a quick overview of your background and what brought you to this work. Natalie, do you want to start?
Sure, I'd be honored to. Thank you so much for having us, Tonya. And thanks for kicking off this conversation. You all have really been leaders in this movement that is happening all over the country. But there is a lot of energy in the DMV area, both in the pilots and in the policy change that I think these pilots are spurring on, that will put money in people's pockets and create the stability, the mobility and the prosperity that you talked about so beautifully. I launched Economic Security Project with two colleagues, Dorian Warren and Chris Hughes, about 6 years ago. And prior to that, I became very interested in how we move ideas from the margins to the mainstream. Van Jones and I launched an organization in 2011. And before that, I worked for President Obama running the digital team in Washington, D.C. And we helped pass the Affordable Care Act. And it was at that moment I thought, who gets to decide what the conversation is? And how do we support some of these big ideas that have such data and experience into moving into, the mainstream and becoming the next Affordable Care Act, the big giant discussion we have as a country, and then ultimately a policy win. So that's a little bit about my background, and I'm based in California, in Oakland, and I'm just really delighted to be here.
Great, thank you. Welcome, Natalie. Geeta, tell us a little bit about your background. It's always great to be in conversation with other community foundation leaders.
And same for us. I mean, I think your work continues to inspire lots of people, including us. And I want to say a huge thank you to you first for taking on this very important work and having this really important conversation, at a time when the value of this movement is becoming more and more both popular, and it's taking hold across the country. So I'm the president of the Cambridge Community Foundation. We are actually a very small foundation. We were established in 1916, and we call ourselves a 100-year-old startup because for the first 100 years, we actually continued to be a charity. Our mindset was, how do you give away money? And we've now shifted very squarely into the change maker, convener, catalyst space. My personal background has actually been in the area of community development. So I have understood firsthand, working mostly in the Boston area, just the lives of the people whose lives we are all seeking to change, and how little trust we have, our policy systems have in them, and how we actually often treat our most valuable, assets, our people, without a level of dignity, which I think a lot of our public programs and public policies actually enable. So what got me really fascinated about guaranteed income was really the issue of dignity, the idea that, everyone has that right to dignity, and how we treat people and how we give them choices about what they do with their lives and how they make their life decisions, was really encapsulated in this idea of giving cash rather than the big brother top-down attitude of, you need this training, you need that education, not understanding where families come from. So I am really delighted to be a part of this movement and to see where we can take this from a policy perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today. Natalie, why don't you set the stage for us? Talk about what the data and the research is showing, what success is beginning to look like, and how this can be used as a tool for stability and economic mobility.
Yeah. Well, when I think of stability and mobility and ultimately prosperity, I think of a moment I had in Jackson, Mississippi. So this was a few years ago, and I got to go visit Dr. Aisha Yandaro and her early work with the Magnolia Mothers Trust. This pilot in Jackson and a pilot I'll talk about shortly in Stockton kicked off this movement around 2017. Dr. Yandaro gives $1,000 a month to Black women in Jackson that she's been in relationship with through her nonprofit. And it's called the Magnolia Mothers Trust. And so I went down, I got to visit, and I went to the community room of the housing complex that one of the participants in the second cohort of Magnolia Mothers Trust mothers lived in. And so we sat across the room in the community table, and she talked about how her dream had been to be a phlebotomist. And she was enrolled in night classes in addition to her retail job. and had not been able to pay tuition a couple of years ago. Well, if you can't pay tuition, then you can't re-enroll and you cannot continue in the classes. She owed $400. So for years, she'd had to defer that dream and continue in her job because she couldn't scrape together $400. With her first Magnolia Mothers Trust check, she walked into the community college. She gave them $400. That put her back in the correct side of the ledger, and she was able to continue on her classes. Ultimately, she'd graduate, she'd become a phlebotomist, and that was her ticket. That is what she wanted to do for her own sense of economic mobility and the stability she wanted to have for her family, and ultimately the prosperity she hoped that it would bring. And that's just one example of the types of roadblocks people in poverty and low-income Americans experience every day. And cash is unique in that it allows people to make their choices and to solve problems that are different each month. One month, it's the transmission is out on the car. The next month, it's, I can't quite scrape together. I didn't get enough hours at my retail job, so I can't quite scrape together enough to make rent. And everybody's situation is different, and cash allows the flexibility to help people solve the holes in their lives. So put simply, a guaranteed income is a regular payment of cash, that comes each month usually, but it could be quarterly, it could be on a different, but the key is that it's regular and that it's cash with no strings attached. That people are the arbiters of their own financial lives, and that they can live with dignity and make the choices that they need. And it's an old idea, one that was talked about at the founding of America through many of the writers at that time, and one that really had a surge of interest in the late 60s and early 70s. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote about this idea of a guaranteed minimum income in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, where he said he believes the only way to solve poverty is to guarantee an income or a job. And he talked a lot about guaranteed income, and then that was lost. And at the time, I will say President Nixon was interested in this idea, and there was a lot of bipartisan fervor, but it was sort of lost through the 80s and the 90s in Reaganomics until about 6 or 7 years ago, when Michael Tubbs, the mayor of Stockton, and Dr. Aisha Yandaro in Jackson, alongside the Economic Security Project, we were pleased to be the first investors in both of those projects and worked very closely to really demonstrate what it would look like in an American city to give people cash. And from that demonstration in Stockton and Jackson, and in Stockton, we saw 125 families receive $500 a month with no strings attached. And there were researchers who worked closely with the families. There was a control group who did not receive the money, so you could compare and contrast. And from those pilots, we've now seen over 100 pilots announced just a few months ago all over the country. And you all who are involved with the pilots in the DMV know that it is not an easy task. It is a lot of work to raise the money, to figure out the disbursements, to make sure people are taken care of. Because the thing with our safety net today is that if you have just a bit too much income, you could lose something as important as your housing vouchers. So it's incredibly important to make sure people are, not left worse off when they participate in these pilots. What's also exciting is the work around the policy that's happening, expanding the earned income tax credits, expanding the child tax credits are ways to think of a guaranteed income that put money into people's pockets on a regular basis.
Thanks, Natalie. I just appreciate that both you and Geeta mentioned the word dignity in your opening remarks, which I so appreciate. I remember just in 2019 when the federal government here shut down. And for us, it's a big deal when the federal government shuts down because there's so many linkages to our economy that link back to the federal government. And at that time, we were even trying to figure out how do we get cash even to low-income government workers or government contractors, and we couldn't figure it out. It really did take the pandemic for both donors to be more willing to see cash disbursement as a useful tool, and for us, I'd say as philanthropy, to figure out the partners, like to figure out the disbursement activity and the disbursement methods, to do some benefits analysis to make sure that people would not be negatively impacted. But I want, Geeta, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit of the context of the city of Cambridge and the work of the pilot that you all have launched there.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Natalie. It is always so inspiring to sort of hear the background, the history, and really get the context. Because this issue, I think, is really rooted in my mind, a lot in the issue of income inequality in our country and actually all across the world. And we never quite calculate the cost of inequality, what it costs us to actually keep people poor rather than let them get up the economic ladder. So, let me give you a little context about the city of Cambridge. We're a relatively small city, 120,000 people. It is the core, the center of the region's innovation economy, with Kendall Square, where it's home to the biotech sector. It's the area where the first coronavirus vaccine was first developed. We are considered the mecca of education with 3 major universities, Harvard University, MIT, and Lesley University. We are a city that's diverse, that's vibrant, it's quirky urban community. We are a central city where many neighboring communities and people from many neighboring communities come to for services, and we are a global brand. On the other hand, we are the quintessential tale of two cities. The income disparities between the lowest income households and the wealth in Cambridge, which has significant wealth, is actually astounding. We have families that are earning at or below 50% of the federal poverty line. So, in your trajectory of going from stability to mobility to prosperity, we have actually added from crisis to stability to mobility to prosperity. So it's interesting that we have almost the same framework, but it is shocking to see that 1 in 8 individuals in Cambridge are food insecure. The bottom 40% of our households pay more than 50% of their income for housing, and they earn on average about 60,000. So you can imagine you're paying 30,000 for housing, and on 30,000 you're trying to bring up a family. We have persistent racial gaps in education and income outcomes, in housing, home ownership, in just about everything. And in particularly, the education gaps have been persistent for years, and they are a pathway to economic prosperity. We have our Black and brown kids performing at 30 to 40%, and our white and Asian kids performing at 80 to 90%. I often say this to people in Cambridge, that I'm actually embarrassed to talk about these disparities, particularly in a community that has so much wealth. We should have no reason why we have this kind of poverty. Within that context, we are this very tiny little organization, 50 million in assets. We have a staff of about 11 people. And we have taken on an approach that actually uses philanthropy to instigate change, to disrupt status quo, to push innovation and shift policy. We're now getting into sort of the policy space and let government do the scaling up. And I think that is what a lot of our bigger efforts are aimed at, the policy efforts are aimed at. And as I mentioned earlier, equity and the right to human dignity is at the core of our values. It is what drives us, and it's what has been the impetus for us to get into this work around guaranteed basic income and economic mobility.
Geeta, I share a similar embarrassment sometimes when talking about the wealth disparities in the center of the nation's capital. I mean, for DC alone, it's 81 to 1. White residents have 81 times more wealth than Black residents, and then there are 9 of the 20 wealthiest jurisdictions in the entire country are within our broader footprint. So I often say that it is incredibly harsh and difficult to be poor in the greater Washington region. And so much of our work is really being influenced by trying to, narrow that gap and to ease the ability to live a thriving and prosperous life in our region.
I'd like to add a little one statistic. There was the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston actually did a study a couple of years ago about, it was called The Color of Wealth. I think it's a really stark reminder of how bad the disparities are. Yeah. The net worth of an average Black household, a Black American household was -8. And the average net worth of a white household was 274,000. It was like that kind of a contrast. And so I think this is, I think it is the failure of our community, us as a community as a whole, to have not dealt with these disparities. They are costing us a lot, and they will continue to cost us a lot unless we do something about it.
Absolutely. We've not dealt with them in generations.
Yes.
And they've compounded themselves. Natalie, please.
Well, and we've had a very harmful ideology that says this is an individual failing,
Absolutely.
that it is a person's own problem because they are poor. And that is not true. We know structurally and systemically it has caused so many communities of color to be locked out of the wealth creation that happened in America over generations. And so I think of what we're doing today as a conversation that's saying, no, this is a systemic problem and we have systemic answers to righting some of these wrongs.
Would you mind talking about this notion of no strings attached? And again, this kind of plays into the unfortunate negative stereotypes about poor people and money, the fact that many believe that it creates a disincentive to work. Could you help us to dispel some of those myths?
Yeah, one of the incredible, experiences is sitting with different recipients of these guaranteed income programs and hearing exactly how the budgeting works in their brain down to the penny. These mothers in Jackson knew exactly where every dollar was going to go and also knew the cliffs to our social safety net, to where if they made $1 more a week, they could be adversely impacted. So the way that the financing and the budgeting and the extraordinary efficiency with money was working, was just very, very impressive. The problem is not that people aren't working. The problem is that the economy is not working for them, and that one job in America is not enough. It's not enough if you're working minimum wage work to put food on the table, pay rent, much less have the prosperity and the joy of taking your kid to Chuck E. Cheese or saying yes to the $8 carton of raspberries that your kid really wants at the grocery store, but that's probably a splurge you shouldn't do if you're really tight on money. And those are just some of the stories that we heard from parents who were getting child tax credit checks about what they were able to do with those checks during that 6-month period when there was a guaranteed income pilot in the nation where every parent in America received these checks. It was, of course, people were able to pay down debt. People were able to fix cars. People were able to invest in themselves and actually get a job that was, one that paid more or had childcare or was closer to home, something that worked better in their lives, but also able to feel like they could be a good parent. And those are the types of things that don't show up on the receipts or the ledgers. So all that to say, that only works if there's no strings attached. Our safety net right now has a lot of strings attached. You stand in lines to fill out forms. You have inspectors come to your home. You're kicked off for any number of violations, including making too much money or having too much saved up in your bank account. And those are the strings that I think guaranteed income is pushing back and saying, no, people have dignity and they can be trusted to be the arbiters of their own financial lives.
I have a very interesting story that I want to add to that. But I wanted to say that we often do research and there's a lot of randomized control trials and studies that are being done about how people use the money. And I think that's been proven. People they know how to use the money, stretch their dollar to the absolute limit. And they use it for basic needs. They use it to pay down debt. They use it to invest in their education. And every now and then they might use it to take their kids out to lunch or to a movie or something. But if you think about connecting that with the importance of the mental health and the loss of stress, that situation, that kind of an outing might cause, you recognize the benefit of that. And I think the power of the research going forward is going to be in the stories that we're able to tell, the myths that we are able to debunk about poor people, how they live, how they make decisions. And the story that I want to tell you is that I was being interviewed by a reporter recently, and he said to me, he said, there are, I've just talked to a few people who think this is a waste of money. We are throwing money away at people. These people will become lazy. They won't do any work. They'll quit their jobs and just sit at home. And so I said to him, I asked him, I said, do you own a home? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, so do I. And I asked him, I said, do you take a mortgage, interest deduction on your taxes? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, so do I. So I said, you know what, you're getting a public subsidy. Does anyone ask you or me how we spend that money?
Absolutely.
And so this, nobody asks us, it's no strings attached. That is no strings attached. And we all get a lot of these benefits that I think people with resources, with assets, with wealth are able to utilize. And at the same time, we ask our most needy households to have to be able to explain or stand in that line or fill in that additional form. We make them go through hoops for time that they don't have, time they could spend with their children, time they could spend, enhancing their own life prospects. So I think it's really important to make sure that we are changing the mindset of people and developing this deep understanding about the value of this no strings attached money. That really, I think it's like cash is king. You ask the families, they tell you that. That's what we need.
Absolutely. Geeta, I'm curious about how, given our similarities as community foundations, how are your donors or fund holders responding to the work?
So, I have to say that it was really interesting. We did a webinar very similar to this. We launched the Guaranteed Basic Income Pilot in February of 2021, and we just finished it in 23. We launched it for fundraising, formally launched it in August of 2021, and just finished the 18-month period. And so we had a webinar very similar to this, and in 3 weeks, we were able to raise $1.5 million.
Wow.
And I'll tell you, I think that what I was, first of all, it was really impressive to see the generosity of donors. When you put it in the context of families and you explain, and they hear this kind, because we had a very similar conversation. We actually had Mayor Tubbs from Stockton actually come and speak at that webinar. And that when people hear the stories about how people use these funds and what it means to them, that when we talk to them about every family having different needs and each one having the ability to meet the needs that they had of that month or of that period, people gave very generously. I think a lot of people sort of, we got gifts everywhere from $5 to $500,000.
Oh, wow.
And there were many people who said, I would like to support one family, so I'm going to give 9,000 because that's what it costs. Other people calculated and said, I would like to do 10 families. And yes, there's some other costs, so I'm going to throw in 100,000. I think people came to it with enormous understanding and empathy. Knowing the fact that, if I am born poor, it's a circumstance of my birth. It's not my destiny, and it is not my fault. Right. And I think it is that idea of sharing your prosperity with others that I think really resonated well with people, thinking, if I can make a difference to one family, I can actually make a difference to, to a generation. I think it's that kind of thinking, that we were very struck. We had individual donors, we had institutional funders, our universities pitched in, our companies pitched in, and we were sort of really taken aback at how quickly, the money rolled in for us to do the pilot. We had planned for a 100-person pilot. We were able to do 130 families.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Congratulations to you and to your team and to your funders, your fund holders and partners for galvanizing so much interesting goodwill. I'm curious because both of you mentioned evaluation. And my hope is that at some point, the model will have been proven and we're really focused on, doing pilots where we need to continue to get to be a catalytic sort of engine to get things going. But then we're on a path to scaling these up into the mainstream. Natalie, can you help talk us through what that has the potential to look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes too with the trajectory I'm seeing donors on as well, which is, people funding the pilots, both the disbursements directly to people and the research and the narrative work around the pilots that I think are so important because they themselves are challenging these old outdated notions of a social contract in America and what it needs to look like and what it doesn't. But then also starting to fund advocacy and policy work, the research needed, the power building needed to actually pass policy. The vision here is not that we will launch so many pilots that like a certain percentage of America is saturated and it will always be philanthropically funded. The vision is that philanthropic dollars really served for the R&D in the early days, the days we're in right now, the research and evaluation, and the power building muscle to pass policy. There was a question in the chat, is this income? Is this in the tax code? The vision is to expand, to use the tax code to create a guaranteed income. You can do that right now by modernizing and expanding the earned income tax credit, which has been a long held, for 40 years, we've had the EITC in America. It's been bipartisan supported. It can approximate a guaranteed income if you pay it out monthly, if you expand who's included and expand the definition of work and modernize the definition of work and, really grow the credit. Same with the child tax credit. It's been around for a long time, but only during the pandemic did we see it truly impact every kid in America. Did you know that half of the Black and brown children in America live in households where the income is too low to qualify for the child tax credit that's been on the books for 20 years? To your point about tax policy and who actually gets subsidized and who doesn't, Geeta, I am and that wrong was righted in last year when we expanded the child tax credit and said every parent in America receives these checks. So that is the ultimate vision of a stepping stone toward making, federal what it is that's being piloted. I think it's a decade-long project. I think it requires patient capital, people who are excited about the momentum we see right now and the local leadership, alongside Geeta's leadership in Cambridge, her Mayor Siddiqui, is one of the, exciting leading lights. And to have both the community foundation and the mayor, you have this in the DMV area as well. And a lot of great policy minds who are teaming up with the, pilots to make sure the long-term vision is held.
So I also wanted to respond to the questions that were in the Q&A. The pilots are made possible by the fact that we are often negotiate with state government to waive using this income as added income on their, for their benefit purposes. And actually, in Cambridge, we were able to make sure that none of people's benefits were affected. And I tell you what I find fascinating is the fact that our state partners, our policy makers are actually very much in sync and understand these issues. There are often people, who lead your Department of Transitional Assistance or Human Services and all. They are actually dealing with it every day. They are as frustrated by the federal policy constraints that we on the ground, who are working on the ground, are. And in fact, in our case, we were able to take our pilot, the 130-person pilot, and use ARPA funds, the American Rescue Plan Act funds, which were the COVID relief funds that went to municipalities, and persuade our city government to use 25% of those funds to expand the cash assistance as cash assistance, not guaranteed basic income, but cash assistance.
Right.
They're comfortable with the idea of child tax credit as cash assistance, but not with the idea of guaranteed basic income. So I think, Natalie, to your point, there is a big leap that we have to take. This is a decade-long project to get people to the idea, understanding the idea of guaranteed basic income. But I think what is sort of interesting is that even at that expanded level, where we are going to be, I think we're the only project in the country, thanks to our small size, that we are able to cover every household earning below 250% of the federal poverty line, which is about 70,000 or so for a family of 3. And it is 50% of the area median income. And it is not an income that people, even with that 250% of the federal poverty line, people are not able to live in Cambridge and pay and manage all of their expenses. I think you mentioned earlier, Natalie, in your earlier remarks about how wages, or I think was it you, Tanya, you talked about the fact that our wages have not gone up at the rate that the cost of living has gone up.
Right.
And our federal poverty levels are pathetic. It has increased to 24,600 for a family of 4. You tell me one place in America where a family of 4 can live on that income. We put up these false measures and then hold people accountable to not being able to live up to that. We don't increase a basic income, a minimum wage.
Right.
I think there's a lot of work that needs to go into that. And the pilots are all helpful because I think they use groundswell kind of an idea. They feel like there's a groundswell and there's more and more and more agreement on it. But there are so many associated things that are policy related that we all have to work on and make sure that we're creating a change on, including what do we count as basic, minimum income? What is a federal poverty level? And how we use public resources to get people up the economic.
Yeah, I appreciated so much of what you all have said, especially on the amount of work to get these pilots up and going. We've now participated in 4, and we're trying to get a 5th one up and going. And I'll tell you, in the case of our partnership in Northern Virginia and the Arlington Guarantee, they had to get a waiver from Richmond to be able to not rub against benefits. In DC, we had to do benefits counseling for every single individual so that they could make the choice between whether they were would stand to lose some benefits, or if the participation in the program would be so much more additive that it was potentially make the loss of any benefits worth it. And then in other jurisdictions, we've had to choose participants who were so far removed from bumping up against any benefits cliffs that it wouldn't matter as much. There is so much really, I think, thoughtful engagement that has to go into selecting program participants, figuring out the distribution partner, figuring out the benefits part of it. So I hear you in saying, even though it wears me out thinking about it, that this is a 10-year run to get to full uptake across the country. I'm curious of any other glimmers of like a progress that we should be holding to that will help us to get to the, to cross to this 10-year guidepost.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited about Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. So this grew out of Stockton, and Mayor Michael Tubbs launched it with a bunch of founding mayors. Mayor Siddiqui of Cambridge is one. And my mayor in Oakland, California, former Mayor Libby Schaaf was one as well. And there's over 100 mayors now who've signed on and said this is the type of thing that would revitalize cities, that would support neighborhoods, that would support local economies, that would start to get at the racial income gap in America that is incredibly immoral, that persists, and of course the poverty. And so we're going to support this and call for a federal guaranteed income, and many of them are demonstrating in their cities. And just about 3 weeks ago in Georgetown, in DC, we launched the Counties for a Guaranteed Income, also with Mayor Tubbs's leadership. And so these are about 30 county commissioners who are also saying the same thing. This is co-chaired by Tony Preckwinkle, Commissioner Preckwinkle out of Cook County, which is the Chicago county, and then Holly Mitchell, Commissioner Holly Mitchell out of LA County, who are long champions of anti-poverty programs and really see guaranteed income as the next big thing. And so these are elected officials who are putting their, credibility and their political capital on the line to say, this is the type of idea that I believe in. So I think that's what's so great for donors today, is that there is a lot of support for this idea. It's no longer a risky idea, but it is one. It's in that moment where it needs to be pushed through to pass, or all of this all of this won't have added up. And so that's the reason I think to come in today.
And
please.
No, I was going to just add that, that this, I think the other thing that I see as a glimmer of hope is that, it's gone from the mayors to counties, but the state of California is using 35 million of its fund for guaranteed basic income in LA and San Francisco. We have Chicago, Cambridge, Seattle, Minneapolis, using American Rescue Plan Act. So we are actually starting to make headways into the public funding arena, where those funds are now, and so I think that's a very powerful place to be, because really, the role of philanthropy is what we are doing. We are instigating stuff at the bottom. We are creating that groundswell. We are creating the momentum. And at some point, that momentum will leap into policy, where we will not have, as I think Natalie was, when we were having a conversation earlier, had mentioned that, once it gets into the space that it's a public policy, it's not going to affect your income. It's public, like the tax credits didn't affect people's incomes. And I think that would be real progress, if we can get to move the country to that space.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited. I think Will Jawando, Councilmember Will Jawando from Montgomery County, was one of the leaders in the county guaranteed income. And he was, the council member who instigated the guaranteed income pilot in Montgomery County. We've also had the benefit of a very progressive in the district using ARPA funds to get to use more for cash transfer investments in excluded workers. We refer to our undocumented workers as excluded workers, but we were able to support them in moving, upwards of $50 million to people who were not eligible for other kinds of cash transfer programs. The other thing I wanted to mention is just some of the more progressive things that are happening in our region that we're instigating at the philanthropy side and then seeing government pick up. But the baby bonds effort that was recently passed in the District of Columbia, again, is another sort of way of instigating this. How do we help kids to move from, families to move from crisis? And I appreciate that additional framing, Geeta, from crisis to stability to mobility and then prosperity. I wanted to take a quick look in the chat. Have pilot programs only been initiated in urban areas in the U.S.? Can you speak to any pilots that have been launched in rural areas?
Yeah, there are a few that have been launched in rural areas. But I'd also point to Alaska, where for the past 40 years in Alaska, they've had the permanent fund. And that is coming out of oil royalties. They put in a sovereign wealth fund in the state. And then every year a dividend is paid out to every Alaskan resident kids and adults, with no strings attached. Now it comes once a year, but they count on it every year. And so one of the earliest things we did was commission research in Alaska to understand what do we know about the cash with no strings attached that are very American, because at that time there was a lot of pointing to Europe to sort of say, well, this is what we're talking about. And we're actually, no, there is versions of, this is what Social Security is. For people above 65, there are regular checks that come in every month with no strings attached. That is one of the most popular programs in America and has basically eliminated poverty for elders. And so it is no different than Social Security for all. So what do we learn in Alaska? Well, we learned that birth weights went up, that birth rates went up, that people felt, less stressed, that they used the money on, basic goods. It's the type of thing we're seeing across some of the pilots where the research has already come in as well. So I would point to that. And then the other thing I'd point to is that currently in the States, we are seeing a real bipartisan support for the child tax credit. So you have the governor of Montana, who is by his own admission far right, leading the child tax credit fight in Montana. You have Nebraska looking at a child tax credit as well, with the premise being this will help keep Nebraskans in Nebraska. They don't have to move for opportunity if we can have a social safety net like this. So I do think both the policy and the pilots are starting to take root in rural areas alongside a lot of the urban pioneering cities that have led the way.
Is there any utility in distinguishing between universal basic income and the guaranteed income pilot? Because as we think about closing the racial wealth gap, I think it's just important in context. And I think you all have done a bit of that, Geeta and Natalie, in your opening remarks about who's faring the worst in these communities and why we're targeting specific demographics as opposed to others. But would either of you care to speak to that?
I'll let Natalie go first. She's the expert.
Sure. Well, I think,
have an opinion.
I think the operating word here is guarantee, that it's guaranteed. Now, who does it go to? How often does it come? And how much is it? Those are all policy decisions that we can have, or, conversations we can have. And I will say that has been the goal, to get into that conversation. Not should we do it, but how should we do it? And so universal basic income is one version that says everyone gets a check, regardless of how much they make, where they live. So that is the Alaska version, right? Every resident in Alaska receives the check. I think this is really an exciting idea. I think today means testing it, meaning saying, for example, in the case of the child tax credit, it's every household that makes under $400,000 receives the child tax credit checks. That's a way of means testing the policy that targets the money to families who need it the most. And because for decades or centuries, communities of color have been shoved into low-wage jobs, you tend to have a disproportionate impact on communities of color, and therefore can really start to get at, the racial income gap and wealth gap in America.
Yeah, no, I don't think I have anything much to add to that, but except like if you look, in a sense, the universal basic income is like countrywide, citywide, statewide, whatever safety net. It's like everyone is sort of taken care of. Whereas I think the guaranteed basic income has tended to be much more equity focused.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, let's first take care of those who are getting left behind for no fault of theirs. And I don't think any of those people would be opposed to a universal basic income, so long as we're meeting the basic needs and giving those who are getting left out a leg up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because if you look at Europe, and I talk to, this is more anecdotal than research based, that when I talk to friends in Europe and I tell them about, the food insecurity issues in America, they're just like surprised they don't have it in their countries, because there's everyone gets a basic something.
Yeah.
If you're a parent, if you're a mother, you get taken care of for the first couple of years while you're taking care of your child at home. what does that do? It increases the possibilities of that child doing well, early childhood, the parents bonding. I mean, there's just so much that happens, as a result of people's basic needs being met. And
Yeah,
that's something that we have to consider as a country. Like, what are we about?
absolutely. It's something we have to consider, interrogate, and wrestle. I think in more homogenous communities, it is apparent. Of course, we need to have our basic needs met, but I do think, and it's unfortunate that the experience of racism in the United States, it forces us to question sort of good policy and good practical approaches to this work, which is why I think that it's so important that we continue to demonstrate that these interventions are important ones that we take, that they are equity focused, that they help to level playing fields. And I appreciate that they have to be pursued persistently for a long period of time in order for us to get the outcomes that we are hoping for. Natalie, it looks like you wanted to say something.
Oh, I just was thinking about how early on this conversation was really focused on automation and concern around the job market and the idea that like jobs would all go away once automation, moves into the world. And one of the big shifts we made, along with Mayor Tubbs's leadership and others, was to say, you don't need to look to a future concern to make the case for this idea. Certainly Dr. King didn't. And you only need to look at the here and now, the what we've been talking about in the DMV area and in Cambridge, and certainly out here in California, the immoral discrepancy between the have and have nots. That is the reason to institute a guaranteed income today. And then the pandemic, as you said so well, opened up the political possibility to do this at a federal level. We've had crises before, but we didn't send people money. That is a big shift.
It is.
And this movement was ready. And the minute the political opportunity and the crisis, which, very unfortunately happened, we sent stimulus checks. We instituted the child tax credit. We sent money directly to families. And that is a big shift. And I hope it is the beginning of a new social contract that, cash is just the beginning. Baby bonds, as you pointed out, are a really important step toward supporting children to graduate into a world where they can take a risk. They can be entrepreneurial. They can invest in themselves because they have just a little bit of an account of money set aside to help them, survive. And so you're looking at the income, you're looking at the wealth and wages. Certainly, all of this sits alongside higher minimum wages that support families, that support working families. So I think it's all part of a future social contract, and that's the way to talk about this. To make the case, in addition to the concerns of future, automation.
Absolutely. Thank you. I want to make sure, I can't believe we're at almost an hour already. That time went by so very quickly. But if there were any one or two final points you wanted to make, I'm happy to have you to offer any final thoughts as we wrap up the conversation. Geeta, anything from you?
Well, I would just like to say to your listeners on the webinar today, I think you have a real opportunity. I think your community is doing an amazing job in lifting all of this. And the more of this kind of work we are doing, the more possibility it will create to create the kind of systemic change that we want to. We are still at the point where we are proving out through pilots. Every pilot that I think has been taken on through the Mayors for Guaranteed Income has picked a different, they focused on a zip code. They focused on a population type. We focused on single mothers. There are ones that were focused on single fathers. There are ones that are focused on certain income groups. There are short-term and long-term. And in each of these, we've learned something new. And it's added more visibility and light into the life and the struggles and the possibilities. There are pilots that are going on that are now looking at the deep narratives to try to understand how this has impacted children's educational outcomes, how it has impacted housing stability of families, I think there's still a lot to be learned, but I would say thank you all for what you're doing and for your generosity to those who have a little less than you. So
Mm.
I want to thank I want to thank Natalie, you, Tanya, for holding this conversation, for the wealth of wisdom you bring, Natalie and to everyone who's listening. Your generosity is what helps us create change in our community. So keep it going, please.
Absolutely. Thank you, Geeta. Natalie.
I just say, I don't think it's often you get the opportunity to have such a return on your investment. Both in the way we've been talking, we are now unlocking public dollars. That will continue. So the philanthropic dollars are leveraged, many, many, many times over as counties and cities are able to build on the philanthropically funded pilots and, leverage public dollars, but also in the lives of people, the return on investment in the lives of people who experience less stress, who experience the ability to say yes to their children, to spend a leisurely Saturday morning with their kid at the pool instead of having to drive, Uber Eats to make ends meet. That's what we're doing here. And so it's wonderful to get to spend time with you all who are leading the way in the DMV and Cambridge, and really think about how together we're going to remake the social contract.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who participated in this call, this webinar with us today. We certainly appreciate it. We've seen so much generosity in our community over the last several years. We are inviting our partners, our fund holders, our donors to continue with us as we invest more deeply in the strategies that we believe are going to help to move people from stability, from crisis to stability, mobility, and to prosperity. Thank you again, Natalie and Geeta, for sharing your experiences of your communities. We certainly appreciate it, and look forward to learning more on this journey with you into the future. We want to invite you all to our next in the series, In Pursuit of Economic Justice, where we'll do a primer on children's trust accounts, which is another tool in our toolbox for economic growth and prosperity and closing the racial wealth gap in our region. Thank you all again. Please enjoy the rest of this. It's a beautiful day on the East Coast in the Washington, D.C. area, and I hope it's a lovely day for you all wherever you are. Thank you, everyone. Be well. Big thank you to Melon and to Tierra for organizing this webinar. Thank you so very much.